For this project, I'm using a real pattern from 1916, which has been digitized by Wearing History on Etsy. I want the dress to have a pink skirt with a white blouse and a purple sash. Perfect Barbie colors. And I just so happen to have some pink and purple silk dupioni left over from my Outlander Annalise costume that I made last year. I didn't have quite enough of the pink left to make the pattern, but I decided that the skirt would just have to be a little less full than the pattern calls for, and because it has a gathered skirt, it would most likely turn out fine. I sewed up the back seam of the skirt, leaving about 10 to 12 inches at the top so that I can get the skirt on over my hips. Then I sewed a 3-inch wide hem using my machine. Now, normally when I hem garments, I do it by hand so that the stitches are hidden, but this skirt has several wide tucks down the length of it, and so I wanted the stitching on the hem to mimic the stitching from those tucks. So lucky me, I was able to use the machine and get it done faster and have a nice style point as well. Speaking of those tucks, how did I get them to be even all the way across the skirt? Well, the pattern has the lines marking where you need to fold and where you need to sew those tucks. So referencing those and then using a clear ruler, I used pins to mark out those points all the way across the width of my fabric. So then I could follow the pins and make sure that they lined up as I was folding it and before I sewed it. Another trick to getting those tucks perfectly placed was to make sure to iron the fold and really crease that edge before sewing. So that way it all lays nice and flat and I know there won't be any weird wrinkles or bubbles in it after the tuck is sewn. Because the tucks are so deep, about 3 inches, the edge of the fabric didn't line up with any of the stitch markers that come on my machine. So I took a piece of painter's tape, measured out where I needed the edge of my fabric to go, and then laid that painter's tape down and was able to use that as my stitching guideline. Then once the tuck was stitched, I simply ironed it flat, repeated for the one remaining tuck in the skirt, and then it was time to move on to the blouse. So this is the bodice front, the 2 pieces, and all I've done is taken the front edge that will form the wrap top, folded it over twice, and stitched it. So kind of like you would hem a pair of pants or a skirt. The bodice has this really pretty gathered section up at the top, right at the shoulder. So I sewed a row of gathering stitches, making my stitches really wide. Sewed 2 of them so that I could gather them along that thread. And then when I stitch the blouse together at the shoulder, I'll be able to run my stitches in between those 2 gathering stitches to make it really accurate. This dress has an inner waist tape to keep it nice and in place right on your waist. And so to accommodate that, the blouse part gets gathered at the waist and stitched down to that waist tape. So here I'm just putting in that row of gathering stitches that will run at both the bottom and the top edges of that waist tape. Next, I sewed the facing to the back of the neckband, and because this is an original pattern from 1916, it did not come with pieces for the facing. It simply states in the instructions to add the facing, and so you cut out a piece that matches the back of the neckline, making it the right width, and then folding under that edge. And the stitch line for the facing will match the stitch line for that like folded back edge on the front pieces. So it was actually kind of a really neat construction method. The front and back pieces are finally ready to be joined together at the shoulder, so they just get matched up, pinned together, and then stitched right down in between the gathering row of stitches from when we gathered at the front bodice piece. Next, the side seams of the bodice are stitched together using a French seam. The waist tape is made of, I believe, 2.5-inch wide gross grain ribbon. And to make sure that I had the right length, I put my corset on and then pulled the ribbon around my waist right where I needed it to be, measured it, and cut. The ends of the ribbon then get folded back twice on themselves and stitched down. Then the bodice is gathered and stitched down to this ribbon, but because the front of the bodice is a cross or a wrap closure, it means that we can't stitch it to the ribbon all the way because we want both sides of that ribbon to remain on the inside of the bodice. So that means that we just need to leave the ribbon and bodice unstitched for a length at the front that will enable us to cross the two ends over one another when we wear it. Next up are the sleeves. These have one seam on the underside and they get stitched up with a French seam also. Then after setting the sleeve head into the armhole, we can stitch those two pieces up together. And this is always my least favorite part of any project. Fitting sleeve heads into armholes is just such a pain, and it always takes me several tries to get it fitting right and looking normal. The sleeves end with this cute little ruffle at the bottom. So after hand hemming the bottom of the sleeve, I sewed another row of gathering stitches right where that ruffle needs to start. So then I can gather it up to the appropriate size and stitch it down to a piece of tape. Now, one difference between this 1916 pattern and how you might do this in a modern sleeve is modern day, we most definitely would use elastic for this, so it would make that ruffle really flexible and probably more comfortable. Because this is gathered down to a piece of tape that doesn't stretch, I've noticed that when I wear it, it can sometimes get caught a little bit on my arm. But it is period accurate. Now let's head back to the skirt. Remember that 10 to 12 inches that we left open at the top of the skirt so that we can get it on over our hips? Well, now we need to add a placket to that opening. And this is the first time that I have added a placket to a skirt because the 18th century skirts that I've done in the past don't use them. The instructions for this pattern assumed that you know already how to add a placket to a skirt. And so they simply just say, sew in the placket. I had to look that up in my Victorian dressmaking techniques book. But essentially, it's not too complicated. You just do a little rectangle of fabric, the same fabric as your skirt, and then fold it, sew it on kind of like you would with like a neck facing. And fold it on itself so that all of those raw edges are covered, so that you're left with this kind of like little piece sticking out underneath the other edge of the skirt. So basically this is just making it so that that opening of the skirt, when the two edges meet, there's another little piece of fabric underneath obscuring the view of, your corset below, if that makes sense. Then to that skirt facing, I sewed a row of hooks and eyes that will serve as the closure. Now the skirt needs to be gathered so that we can attach it to the blouse at the waist. And the waist closure is actually pretty interesting. It's something called a zigzag closure that was pretty common throughout the Edwardian period and stretching into the 1910s. But basically this skirt gets attached to the bodice only on one side. So it gets stitched down to the left side of the bodice and then it gets stitched all the way around to the center back. And then on the right hand side, it's left completely free from the rest of the dress. And then there are little hooks and eyes or snaps that serve to attach the rest of it when you get into it. So this means that the skirt has that center back closure, but the bodice has the center front wrap closure.